Hello students. So this is your session which introduces you to critical reasoning. It's the first of our videos in that particular segment. So we will go over the fundamentals. We will talk about the area in terms of what the concepts are that are involved here, if you would like to call them concepts, and what it is that the exam tests you on. And we'd also talk about how it is that you prepare for it. And then we look at some practice so that we can kind of hone our understanding of what we went through in this video to be able to apply it on our own and to keep track of other discussions as they happen in subsequent videos. Okay, so there is a handout or there is a set of questions that we have for this, which bear the reference number that we have on the slide. But I will get to those questions after we've done some discussion of the concept itself or of the area itself. Okay, so looking ahead, what exactly is this critical reasoning? For one thing, if you do recall your the structure of your GMAT exam, the verbal segment has three sub-segments, one of which is critical reasoning, and it's roughly about 30% of the verbal reasoning section. Okay, what they expect of you is to be able to demonstrate your skills with reasoning and analysis when it comes to making arguments, when it comes to evaluating arguments, when it comes to formulating a plan of action. Now you realize that when you look at these three, making arguments, evaluating arguments, and formulating a plan of action, you have to recognize that the word argument here is not being used in the sense of a dispute. The word argument is being used in the sense of a viewpoint that somebody is presenting and backed by adequate reason or basis. So making arguments would be viewpoints that you put together on the basis of what it is that you have. Evaluating arguments would be recognizing others' viewpoints, recognizing them from the basis they have, and asking how good that viewpoint is, keeping in mind the basis. That means, is there an adequate construction there? And formulating or evaluating plan of action is, can I take an argument or a viewpoint and apply it to circumstance to see what it is that we could end up with by way of things that we decide or choose to do or whatever. Now you realize why it is that this is a test area, because whole business of looking at information, putting it together to be able to understand something from it, and then to be able to decide how you want to use it are the hallmarks of a good decision maker. Now, if you have good reasoning skills, if you can put together good argument, if you can evaluate argument, if you can formulate plans on the basis of well-structured argument, you are on the road to becoming a or presenting yourself as a good decision maker. So that is why this is such a key area in virtually every management, let's say, selection process, and no less in the GMAT. So in the GMAT, 1/3 of your verbal reasoning section is critical reasoning. Now also remember that critical reasoning, when we say 1/3 of the section, we are saying critical reasoning as standalone questions. But do remember that a lot of the questions as part of RCs also are reasoning questions, which means they could very well be critical reasoning questions if they were taken out of the passage and presented to you with a few lines separately. So critical reasoning is more than just the CR section or subsection. It also in some sense overlaps with the RC section also. So we will discuss the CR question, the standalone question, but do recognize that the same skills that you're talking about, the same approach that you would have, the same evaluation that you'd run would happen whether you're looking at a standalone question or you're looking at one that appears in a passage as part of an RC. Okay. Now, so if you're looking at the standalone question, there's an initial paragraph or statement that they provide with a question based on it. Now, this paragraph is what they call a stimulus. Why stimulus? Because it is what you use to be able to prompt your thinking process. It is what you use to be able to ascertain what the person is talking about. So this is the basis for the task given to you. So you have a specific task, and the task is based on this stimulus given to you, which is this initial paragraph. Now that initial paragraph may provide just information or basis, but it could also present a viewpoint or a perspective or an argument of some type. So the stimulus is often referred to when we discuss these things in these CR sessions. The stimulus is often referred to as the argument. The question stem is the line that follows. So basically what we're saying is, I mean to look at, so I just put a little diagram here. To look at, your stimulus is a paragraph, right? And that paragraph would be anywhere from, let's say, 100 to 200 words, let's say. And then it is followed by a certain question statement, okay? So this then is your stimulus and this is your question stem. And then of course you have answer choices, okay? So you have, sorry. And then of course you have answer choices that follow. So there'll be one. In the case of GMAT, there are 5, right? So you get 5 answer choices that follow. Now, would you want to look at the answer choices up ahead? No, you don't. So very frankly, as we go along, we'd be saying that answer choices are the solutions to the task. But the thing is, you've got to kind of recognize what it is you're being asked, try and arrive at a sensible approach to it, try and arrive at a possible answer in your head, and then you get around to looking at the answer choice. That's really what we would suggest that you do. So you have a stimulus, paragraph, you have a question stem that tells you what your task is, and incidentally, the question stem may carry some more basis elements that the paragraph did not have. It could. And then you have answer choices which are offered as solutions to the task. Moving forward, the task requires you to either look at an argument and identify its construction. Okay, so identify parts of the argument, identify the totality that the person constructs. So different parts of the argument you could be asked to identify. You could be asked to identify the kind of thinking that goes on behind it, what we call the line of reasoning. So we call it the logic, but logic is a, what should we say, conversational term. It's like, what we're really saying is, how do people put together their basis to be able to arrive at what they are arriving at. So we'd call it a line of reasoning. So you understand the logic or the line of reasoning, and if there are flaws, that means if there are inconsistencies, then you might be asked to understand those as well. You might be asked to identify those as well. So it could be to identify parts of an argument. It could be to recognize the line of reasoning and identify problems with the argument. It could be to evaluate the argument overall in terms of its strength or weakness. So that's what the task requires you to do. And then you determine the correct answer by eliminating incorrect answer choices and picking the one that actually works. Now, to be able to do this, one should be acquainted with the basic concepts of logical reasoning. So let's see what those are. Now, essentially, your basic concepts, we talked about that. See, what exactly is an argument? An argument is, okay, over here we got an argument as a passage through which the author tries to convince the reader about an idea. So let me put it this way. If I were to tell you that it would be good to start preparation early, now you would probably want to know, why are you saying that? And then if I tell you, considering the fact that there's a lot to cover, it would be good if you start preparation early. Then you know that I'm giving you my basis, which is considering the fact that there's a lot to cover. And then I'm giving you my conclusion drawn on that basis. It would be good for you to start early. Now, in other words, in my mind, I have some basis. And my basis is that there's a lot to cover and you need time to cover it. And then I come up with the conclusion, which is it would be good to start early. That happens in my mind. When I present it to you, I might not present everything that I have in my mind. I might just tell you it's good to start early. And then if you say why, then I might need to give you my reasons. But I might be one of these really, really patient and patient people who explain themselves very well. And I might say, there's a long time, there's a lot to cover, you need time to cover it, and therefore you should start early. In which case I'm really taking care of explaining myself very well. But what exactly is an argument then? An argument is your expression. You realize when you put stuff together in your head, even these things that I told you about, my basis and my conclusion, if I leave them in my head and I don't share them with people, I am not delivering an argument. An argument is presented. That means when you express what you understand based on what you know. So your expression of what you understand based on what you know is your argument. So over here, the stimulus would carry a passage in which the author tries to convince the reader about an idea, opinion, or suggestion by providing supporting reason. That means it is the author's expression of what he understood based on what he knows, and he's trying to put it across to a reader. That would be an argument. Now, within the argument, you could actually have a conclusion. What's a conclusion? The conclusion is where the author wants to get. What is it that the author really wants to give you? What kind of understanding or decision is this person hoping to convey? The conclusion is what the person makes the argument for. The argument is made with the intention of delivering a certain understanding, or with the intention of delivering a certain opinion, or with the intention of delivering a certain conclusion, or a certain decision, and that which is intended to be delivered. That which is intended to be delivered is the conclusion. That means it is the purpose of the argument. It is what the person is putting the argument together for. So the main idea that the author is trying to convince you of by providing supporting reasons is called the conclusion of the argument. That is that means it is in an argument that you read. You come across a statement to say why or how did the person arrive at this? What are the person's reasons for this? Then you know you're possibly looking at a conclusion. What are premises? Well, premises are the reasons. Premises are the basis elements that a person uses to be able to arrive at a conclusion. So you remember when I told you it would be good to start early, then you're prompted to ask, why are you saying that? What are your reasons for that? which means it would be good to start early is a conclusion. Then what are the premises? Then if I state my premises, I would be telling you there is a lot of ground to be covered and you need time to cover that ground. And therefore, putting those two things together, I tell you it would be good to start early. So the supporting reasons that you provide to be able to back a conclusion would be premises. All right. But they need to be presented. So that means your argument is presented. You present a final result. That means you present an understanding and you present certain elements of basis that support that understanding. So that would be your argument, then your conclusion and your premises. Moving forward, is that all there is? Now, for instance, let's just look at what we have here by way of example. Now, cricketer X has performed disastrously in the last World Cup. Now, you realize that is a piece of information. He's telling you that he has not performed well. Since then, in almost all the matches, his scores have been single-digit runs. So he failed in the World Cup and he's failed ever since. So both of these are bits of information. This shows that he has consistently failed to perform. Now, this is what understanding the person has arrived at. If he couldn't perform in the World Cup and he couldn't perform in the matches thereafter, then this shows that he has consistently failed to perform. So we would call this an element of understanding. Therefore, he should be removed from the team. Now, this is an application of the understanding, which means I've understood that he has failed to perform. Now, let's do something about it. What do we do about it? Let's take him out from the team. So you realize that what I have here a premise, okay? I have here another premise. I have here an understanding arrived at. Now, sorry, this is also premise. I have here an understanding arrived at. Now, suppose, could we have terminated the argument here? Yes, you could. In which case, this would have been the conclusion. This shows that he has consistently failed to perform. This would be a conclusion by way of an understanding. But I'm using this understanding to move forward. That means I'm using the understanding as basis, and we call that, therefore, I'm going forward to another conclusion based on this. That means this, which could have been a conclusion on its own if I had terminated the argument here, this becomes what we call an intermediate understanding. And with the basis and the intermediate understanding, I come up to an application, which means there's a decision that I take or a suggestion that I make, which is he should be removed from the team. So you understand, therefore, a conclusion over here. If the argument had terminated here, then this would be in the conclusion. But since the argument moves up to a decision, then this is the conclusion. What are these? Performed disastrously, and since then only single-digit runs. These are premises. Okay. So the conclusion is that he should be removed. The premises are cricketer X has performed disastrously. His scores have been single-digit runs. He has failed to perform consistently. No, he has consistently failed to perform is not the same thing as he has failed to perform consistently. He has always failed to perform is an understanding. So because I don't see, the point is what here constitutes failure. Now, obviously, when you say performing disastrously is failure, then that is my understanding of failure. And if you say single digit runs are failure, then that's my understanding of failure. You realize some people might say, hey, that depends on what the opposition was like. That depends on what the rest of the team did. If the rest of the team had got only zeros, then single digit runs was not necessarily a failure, maybe. So the point is, yes, we are using it as basis, but you realize it is not basis that is factual, it is basis that is understanding. So we would call this intermediate understanding. So now you remember that basis leads to conclusions, but the basis could be factual basis, but it could also be basis by way of intermediate understanding. Okay, it's important to remember that. Okay, so we've got that. So we looked at argument, we looked at conclusions, we looked at premises. Let's move forward. Now, to deal with any CR question correctly, you should be able to identify the bits. You should be able to identify the situation, and within that, if there's a conclusion, then you must identify that. And you should be able to recognize what the related premises are or the relevant premises are. Now, for instance, if you were to look at what we had there, a student may now assume that the first sentence or first few sentences are premises. No, that's not true. The fact is, the person might organize the paragraph however they want. See, I can start with the conclusion and then give you reasons. I can give you a couple of reasons, conclusion, and then more reasons. I can give you reasons and then conclusion. So there is no hard and fast rule that everything should be organized in a certain fashion. So the point is, you need to identify conclusions, you need to identify premises, right? In other words, what you're talking about in the paragraph is, it's nothing but the stuff that a person has used and organized in a certain fashion, but it doesn't have to be organized in a linear fashion that moves from basis to conclusion every time. It could, but it doesn't have to. It could also be conclusion then backed by basis. It could also be major basis, conclusion, and some minor basis after that, whatever. So over here, if you look at it, I can also put it as, I think cricketer X should be removed from the team, which is the conclusion, as he has consistently failed to perform, which is my understanding. And then I have backing by way of information. His World Cup performance and single digit runs. So the conclusion then becomes the first sentence. So the point is, don't look for positions. Don't look for first sentence must be premises, last sentence must be conclusion. That's really not what it is. You have to identify them by recognizing what it is that it prompts in your head. Over here, if we say cricket X has consistently failed to perform, which is my understanding, and so I think it should be removed, which is my application of that understanding, and then I give you the premises that we are using, his World Cup performance and the matches he played after that. So this only goes to demonstrate that it's not as if there is a standard format to deliver an argument in. Conclusions, premises are not necessarily put in a certain order. You have to recognize them from what it is that they prompt in your head as recognition. So you should be careful in identifying them. How do you do that? Now, a conclusion typically, okay, we'll go through this, but I would give you a much simpler way of dealing with it. The conclusion is what causes you to ask, how did you say this? That means I give you a statement and you say, what are your reasons for this? Or how did you say this? Then you're looking at a conclusion. And then if you come to statements which say, why are you giving me this? Now, why are you giving me this would mean, what do you want me to do with it? Which means the person is giving you a basis because he wants you to arrive at some understanding or keep track of an understanding that he's going to end up with. So it's not always easy to identify the conclusion. If you're lucky, you may have indicators, right? For instance, indicators like therefore and as a result and consequently and subsequently, but you might not always have it, right? For instance, over here in the example, when you say he therefore should be removed, then therefore is a conclusion statement. So you have hence and thus and clearly and in conclusion and finally and that is why or for this reason, and all these terms can actually present reasons. But if they don't, if you don't have those statements, then what do? You simply ask, how is he telling this? That means what he's trying to tell me, I know that's the conclusion. But if it is a statement that asks me, that tells me, that says that there is reasons for this, that means it prompts me to ask, how did he put this together? Then you know that you are looking at a conclusion. Okay, premises then. If you look at statements and you ask, why is he giving me this? That means, what does he want me to do with it? Or what is he going to do with it? Then you know that you're looking at premises. So in that example, for instance, you do have indicators sometimes when you have because or you have since or you have as, they could present to you what shall we say, premises. They could present to you reasons. But again, it might not necessarily be the case. So over here we have because cricketer X has consistently failed to perform. So I know because presents a reason. He should be removed from the team. That becomes the conclusion. Okay. So because or as or since or due to or on the basis of or by the reason of, all of these are premise indicators. Okay. And you could also have additional information provided in addition to, additionally, moreover, besides. So all of these indicate that there is a certain amount of basis being provided. But if it is not, if you don't have those indicators, then do remember, you have to ask yourself, why are you giving the statement? What is it you're going to do with it? That way you know you're looking at a premise. Now there are things that are called counter premises. Now counter premise is a statement that counters the premise. Fine. But that means some arguments might have premises, but they might also have other premises, that means pieces of information that seem to contradict what it is that you also have. Which means you end up with a little bit of a puzzle, or you end up with a paradox, which means you're using A as a basis statement, you're also using B as a basis statement, but A and B actually contradict each other. How are you using the two together? So the point is, you might come across areas like that, but then there is a certain thinking that recognizes that there's something that holds the two together. We'll come to that later. So counter premises are given to you through these contradictory conjunctions. You know, when you say but or yet or though or although or even though or despite or however. So that is that. So again, if you're not so lucky, as in you don't really find words that help you identify conclusion or identify a basis, then please remember the why, as in why is he telling me this, is more about purpose. How is he telling me this is the business of what was the reason that he put together. Okay, so do remember that. Then we move on to another things. Now we look at the fundamentals, the things that are actually presented. So a person presents to you an argument which contains premises and a conclusion. So we know that. But suppose the person also uses certain reasons or takes certain reasons for granted, but doesn't share those reasons with you. Then is it that those reasons are not to be considered? No, actually they are. Now, for instance, if I were to say that there is a lot of ground to cover, it's best that you start early. I'm assuming that you need time. I'm assuming that you're not one of these Superman type people who can actually cover lots of ground in very, very little time. So that's an assumption I'm making. So I've given you a premise, which is there's a lot of ground to cover. I've made an assumption that it's going to be difficult for you to cover this ground in a short space of time. And then I come up with the conclusion, which is you need to start as early as possible. So assumptions are also reasons that the author uses in delivering an argument. But why do we call them assumptions? Because the person assumes them to be true, right? Takes them for granted, doesn't share them, expects you to recognize what it is that they're doing. For instance, over here, John is a member of the ABC club, hence he must be a student of Ryan International. So there, the conclusion really is he must be a student of Ryan International. The premise is he's a member of ABC club. So what does it mean? It means that there's an intermediate statement that says that every member of every student of Ryan International is asked to join ABC club. So every student of Ryan International is asked to join ABC club, and only with that statement can you actually arrive at the conclusion that you do. So you realize the premise provided alone is not sufficient, but the one that we just mentioned, no, that every student of Ryan International is asked to join ABC club is the assumption then. It is also something that the author uses to be able to say, therefore, since he is a member of ABC club, he must be a student of Ryan International. Okay, so you get the idea there of what assumptions are. They are premises if they were stated. They are assumptions when they are not stated, but they are there. They have been taken, they have been made use of, and they have been taken for granted. So over here, we are saying John is a member of the ABC club, and we've said all members of ABC club are students of Ryan International, and hence he must be a student of Ryan International. Okay, all members of the ABC club are students of that, which means that, or if I were to put it differently, I could also say all students of Ryan International are asked to join ABC club. So which means hence he must be a student of Ryan International. So now the argument is complete in terms of everything that we used is actually there, right? But it was not presented because it was being taken for granted. So the idea that an author uses along with stated premises but doesn't mention or takes it for granted is called an assumption. It's very critical to the argument, but it's not there in the argument. It's not presented. But that doesn't mean that it's any less important than premises. Assumptions and premises actually are to be looked at on par, at the same level. They are as important as each other. Okay. Now, if you were to identify an assumption in the argument, what you do is you try and identify the thought pattern. That means you look at the premises, understand what it is that they have in common, what is the end result they arrive at, and if that is the case, what must be the bits that must have also been used. It just requires a little bit of thinking about how the person must have put stuff together to be able to recognize that you can identify assumptions. Okay, moving on. Let's take an example here. J.K. Rowling has written a new book. Okay, this is a really old example. This is the seventh Harry Potter book. This must have been years ago. J.K. Rowling has written a new book. This is the seventh Harry Potter book. It is certain to be a bestseller. Now, the conclusion here very clearly is it is certain to be a bestseller. Now, why is it certain to be a bestseller? Because she has written a new book? Because it's a seventh Harry Potter book? Or there is something about J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter that actually makes it a bestseller? So, if I say it is only that J.K. Rowling is an immensely popular author, then how do you know that a Harry Potter book is going to be a bestseller? There must be some other information, right? Harry Potter stories have gripped the imagination of readers all the world over. But while they have gripped the imagination, how do I know it's going to be a bestseller? Her six earlier books in the series, that means J.K. Rowling, the author, and the six earlier books in the series, Harry Potter as part of in the Harry Potter series. So her six earlier books in the series have been bestsellers, right? Now you understand that the person is using that as well. So J.K. Rowling has written a new book. This is the seventh such book. Her previous six such books have been bestsellers. So it would be justifiable to be able to say that this would be a bestseller too. Wizards and magic have always been favorite subjects. That is too large, right? It's too large for this particular thing. This one is specific to J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter. The seventh book in any series is usually a bestseller. That's too far-fetched a statement to make. So which means 3, which is her 6 earlier books in the series of bestsellers, is as much part of the basis as the other two statements are. So you realize that assumptions and premises, it's not that one is more important than the other. They all work together to be able to deliver the conclusion that you want to deliver. Let's move on. So to put it differently then, premises would be stated information, and these are often combined with assumptions, which would be unstated information, and they together would lead to a conclusion. The conclusion is what the author wants to get to. The conclusion is what we call the focus of the argument, or it is the purpose that the author wishes to reach. In other words, it's the destination that the person is heading towards. You realize, in fact, that the argument is constructed for that purpose of arriving at the conclusion. So when you attempt a CR task, right, always keep this in mind, because the stimulus is the basis for the given task. The premises provided therein are always to be accepted as true. You can't say you're using that as a premise, but I know it's not the case. For instance, if I were to say, let's say, if I give you an argument that people really need to use um, abrasive materials to brush their teeth. Now, if I say people need to use abrasive materials to brush their teeth, then what is my basis? And this basis, if I say that teeth tend to get encrusted in very, very short spaces of time. Now, you'd say, hey, that's not always true. That's not the point over here. If that were to be true, then you've got to look at my solutions, at my conclusion. So in a CR question, the fact is that you don't question the premises, because the very line of reasoning of the argument or the logic of the argument depends on those premises. So there's no point you're contesting the premises. You might know that the premises are not complete. You might know that they are not necessarily true. You might know conditions under which they don't work, but that's not asked of you. You are asked, if these are the premises, then what's your conclusion? Okay. So the premises provided are to be accepted as true. Components must first be identified. So when you look at your CR task, you must first identify, okay, what's the situation I'm dealing with? What's the situation there? In that situation, what is the conclusion? If there's no conclusion, then there are premises. Then what would the conclusion be? What is it that the person is heading toward? Then you look at the logic of the composite. That means, what are the premises from which the conclusion is drawn? How do these premises relate to each other? That means, how are they connected? What kind of line of thinking do they follow? And what do they lead up to this conclusion? How do they lead to that conclusion? As in, what arrangement helps these premises lead to that conclusion? Then, now that I know the arrangement, are there gaps in that sequence? Are there things that also must have been taken into account which the person has not stated here? Then you realize you can identify assumptions. So as steps, you need to recognize your situation, break it down to its components, realize how the premises add up to the conclusion, identify the line of thinking that enables that to happen, and then you realize that you can recognize gaps and what must go into the gaps. So you can identify assumptions. And then pay attention to quantifiers and qualifiers. Okay, so they will actually give you an indication of how much this is part of the basis or how much this is a conclusion and so on. So pay attention to terms like all and every and none or most and so on and so forth, because you realize all and every and none you can actually depend on totally, but most is only a large proportion. Some you can't depend on, some because some could go anyway, small, big, whatever. Few, a few, also somewhat uncertain. Always and never, these are very certain. So your quantifiers have certain absolutely clear quantifiers and some which require more information. Similarly with qualifiers. Now qualifiers actually describe it and start focusing on areas that we need to look at. Now if I tell you that all rivers that flow from west to east, I'm looking at the larger aspect of rivers, and then I'm looking specifically at those that flow from west to east. If I say no other coastal coalition government, I'm saying other than this one that we're looking at. So such terms enable you to determine the extent of the truth of that conclusion. That means how far does that conclusion apply and not beyond that. Okay, fine. So this is something about how you pay attention to the composites to work out what parts of the argument they are or what roles they play. Moving on, if we were to sketch it, if we were to put it together briefly, you realize you have premises, okay? So let's just use a few lines here. So you have premises. Now these premises add up in a certain fashion and they lead to a element of understanding. Okay, so they lead to an element of understanding. So we have that as a conclusion if we want to stop with that understanding. But these premises working together lead to this conclusion and you realize what the kind of thinking is, and you realize, oh, then he's not giving me all the premises. So there are assumptions also that I can recognize. Okay, so these premises and the assumptions you recognize because you worked out what the line of reasoning is. Progress through this line of reasoning or in this line of reasoning to reach a certain understanding, which could be a conclusion if I'm going to stop at this point. So if I'm giving you what shall you say, an academic argument, then I would probably stop at this point. But I might take that understanding and take it further. So I take the understanding and I apply it to certain conditions. I apply it to certain circumstances. Okay, I apply it to certain conditions that I have to deal with. I apply it to those, and then I come up with an end result, which I would call an application to these conditions. That means my end result applies to these conditions. That means I've taken my understanding, I've applied to these conditions, and I've turned up with an application, which is a plan or a decision on the basis of what I've got. So do remember that basis works at two levels. Basis works at, so all of this is basis, right? All of this is basis. So basis works at what we would call logical levels, and then there are also elements of basis that work as circumstance, right? Circumstances to which the understanding is going to be employed. So premises plus assumptions would be your basis at logic levels, would lead to a logical understanding, which we would call a conclusion. But if we go forward, then that becomes an intermediate understanding. And then we add more premises or assumptions, which is circumstances, to arrive at the final plan conclusion that we have in mind. Okay, so this, if we put in a stretch, makes things fairly clear. So do remember that there are two types of basis, those which appear as part of the logical build-up and those which appear as part of circumstances, right? So just keep in mind that, because it's important to recognize what kind of premises you're looking at, right? Moving on from that point. So let's see. In this lot, we'll try and identify premises and conclusions and assumptions in these arguments. So let's try some of these things we've talked about. Let's try and identify premises and conclusions and assumptions in the following arguments. Now, obviously, when you see identify assumptions, it means arrive at them, because the assumptions are not going to be printed there. The ones that are printed are called premises. The ones that you have to figure out in terms of this must also be a reason, those would be assumptions. So what we do is we go through it, recognize where the conclusion is, what the premises are, how the premises work together, and therefore what the assumptions must be. Okay, now let's take the first one. The hourly wage of fresh college graduates is about $12 less than that of regular workers. Now this is very clearly information, and it causes us to say, so what do you want to do with this information? Okay, so you know you have a premise right there. Hence, shopkeepers feel that it is economical to hire fresh college graduates to conduct the stock audits in their stores, which is the conclusion that shopkeepers have arrived at. So shopkeepers have concluded that it's economical to hire fresh college graduates to conduct the stock audits in their stores. Now, what prompts the economical part? $12 less than that of regular workers. So, therefore, economical. But you want college graduates to conduct stock audits in your stores rather than regular workers, which means you believe that college graduates can do a fairly decent job about doing it. If you did not believe so, then how would you make this argument? So you realize my argument really is the hourly wage of fresh college graduates is about $12 less than that of regular workers. College graduates can do at least as good a job as regular workers do, and hence it is economical to hire fresh college graduates. So I know that this is a premise, okay? So this one is a premise, right? And this is my conclusion. And the assumption in between is college graduates can actually do this job like regular as well as, or at least close to as well as regular workers can. And that's your assumption. In a survey, the dining habits of about 100 adults were observed. It was found that those who took alcohol just before lunch consumed less calories at lunch than those who did not take alcohol, which means there was a survey. They surveyed about 100 adults, that's a premise. And in surveying these 100 adults, you gathered certain information. What is that? Those who took alcohol just before lunch consumed less calories at lunch. Okay, so more alcohol, less calories than those who did not take alcohol, which means we realized that those who didn't take alcohol probably took more calories. Okay, this indicates that those who want to reduce their calorie intake should consume some alcohol before lunch. In other words, this person is assuming, so the assumption here is that it is only the consumption of alcohol that causes people to reduce their calorie intake. Isn't it? That's the assumption. The assumption is, so I know what my premises are, and then I know what the conclusion is. This is my conclusion again. But the assumption therefore is that it is only the use of alcohol that causes people to reduce calorie intake. Because it is very possible otherwise that some people who consume less calories might have done so simply because they did not want to eat, or because there was something in the food that they didn't like, or there's something about that time of day that they don't really, that lunch is not sometimes that they really eat very much, isn't it? So the point is, so we're only asking how did the person make this argument, and he made this argument because he believes that it is the consumption of alcohol that causes people to reduce calorie intake. So if people consume alcohol, they will reduce calorie intake. That's your assumption there. Baldness will soon be a thing of the past. That's a conclusion. That means he believes that people are no longer going to be bald. So this is a conclusion. The patent of finasteride, the drug that cures baldness in men, expires next month. More companies can then manufacture the drug, and the price will come down to be within the reach of all those who are bald. Okay, so now he's telling me that there is a drug, okay, and that drug cures baldness in men. That drug has a patent which expires next month. Now, if the patent expires next month, then the understanding is that more companies can then manufacture the drug. And the further understanding is that if more companies manufacture the drug, then the price will come down to be within the reach of all those who are bald. And baldness will soon be a thing of the past. That means the assumption here, so this is intermediate understanding again, but this is my conclusion. So the assumption here is that nobody wants to be bald. That given the chance, everybody is going to actually grow hair. So if you say the price will come down to be within the reach of all those who are bald, and then you say baldness will soon be a thing of the past, you're assuming that everybody will use this drug. That means nobody wants to be bald. Everybody wants to cure their baldness. So you realize that actually when you think about the how did the person say this, then you know you have a conclusion. Why is the person giving me this? Or what does the person intend with this? Then you know you have basis. What's the thinking here that happens, and therefore what else must be used would be assumptions. Okay, are we clear on that? Now let's move ahead. So now let's talk about the line of reasoning, or what people in conversation sometimes refer to as logic. So the process of reasoning employed by the author in the argument is called a line of reasoning, right? Which means these premises, if ordered in so and so fashion in this sequence, then represent to you a certain line of thinking, and this line of thinking ends up at a conclusion. So this, what holds the whole thing together and runs through the whole thing, is your line of reasoning. So the methodical process of reasoning employed by the author in the argument is called line of reasoning. Simply put, the journey of the author's argument from the premises to the conclusion and the way he goes about it is the line of reasoning. And when you understand the line of reasoning, you can identify assumptions, if any. An argument that is acceptable, rational, sensible, or logical is said to be a valid argument. Fair enough. Otherwise, it's illogical, then it won't be valid. Now, for instance, if we have this, cricketer X has performed disastrously in the World Cup. Since then, in almost all matches, his scores have been single digits. This shows that he has consistently failed to perform. Therefore, he should be removed from the team, which means I have got a flow here. I've got this and this as bits of information which are chronological. And then it leads to, so I have two bits of information which are chronological, this one and this one. It leads to a certain understanding that I've arrived at, which is he has consistently failed to perform. And since he has consistently failed to perform, there are assumptions. We can't afford to have non-performers in the team. Don't forget, there's an assumption there. We can't afford to have non-performers in the team, and therefore he should be removed. Fine. So now we get it. So now that you call that a logical argument, which means it's a valid argument. Because if the reasons are true, then it is okay to recognize what you understand, and you would also assume that you don't want non-performers in your team, and therefore it's okay to remove him from the team. All right, so this would be a valid argument. What's an invalid argument? Well, obviously something that where the line of reasoning is not justifiable, or seems to not be in a flow that presents to you logical sense. Let's look at that. Cricketer X has neglected his family due to his devotion to cricket. His children too miss him a lot when he goes on tours. This is not fair, so he should be removed from the team. What is the connection? Why do you remove people from the team? You remove people from the team because they can't perform, they can't play. Now that would be logical. You don't remove people from the team because his children are going to miss him. Okay. Now, let's look at something else. Cricketer X has neglected his family due to his devotion to cricket. His children too miss him a lot when he goes on tours. He misses his children such a great deal that he's not able to focus on fielding, bowling, or batting when he's on the field. With these problems, it is not worthwhile keeping him on, so he should be removed. Now, if I start bringing in detail like that, then I can probably make a valid argument. But basically, this is an invalid argument because you remove people because they can't play cricket, not because their children miss them, isn't it? So that is irrelevant. But I can have a set of circumstances where you bring in more information and make an invalid argument valid because you're saying you can't leave. I mean, instead of leaving things to assumption, let me tell you exactly what I have in mind. Let me tell you that this impacts on his performance. Let me tell you that he's not able to concentrate. Let me tell you that, he's dreaming of his children all the time. He doesn't see a ball coming until it hits him on the nose. I mean, then, well, it's high time that he kind of stays at home, right? So the point is, invalid arguments may seem invalid because there's a certain set of reasons that you are looking at. But if you don't leave things to assumption and you start explaining exactly why you're making that argument, it's possible sometimes that an invalid argument, what seems an invalid argument, might actually be valid, but that means a person has left too much to assumption. They should really have explained what they had in mind. Okay. What are logical flaws? What makes an argument invalid? Something that is illogical about it, something that is nonsensical about it, something that doesn't quite connect. Flaws can be two things. I can have a flaw where information that is provided or premises provided don't really connect with each other. That means they should actually work together. If they don't work together, I have a flaw. Or the premises work together, but they don't end up at the kind of conclusion that the person has ended up. That means there's no connect between the premises and the conclusion. Now that's a flaw, which means disconnections are flaws. Disconnections between premises or disconnections between premises and conclusion are flaws. But I can also have misconnections. That means I can have things that actually work together except that you've organized them in the wrong fashion. You've turned them around. You've confused cause with effect. You've confused correlation with coincidence, stuff like that. So the point is, I can also have flaws which are the information may be okay, but you haven't used the bits of information adequately or properly, right? So if you were to consider these and you realize that these are the two broad areas, disconnects are flaws, misconnects are also flaws. So if you look at common flaws, let's look at what we mean. So confusing correlation with causation. Now this is not disconnection, this is misconnection. So X and Y may take place simultaneously, but that does not mean that X causes Y. Okay, so correlation does not necessarily mean causation. Similarly, things happen in sequence, and because they happen in sequence, you believe the prior caused the latter. Not necessarily, they could be independent of each other. You sometimes have generalizations without adequate basis, also called sweeping statements. No? My father smoked all his life and never suffered from cancer, hence smoking does not lead to. Meaning, you take one sample and you apply it to the whole world. Generalizations without adequate basis, right? Ambiguity in statements, where sometimes the meaning itself is such that it's not clear what the connections are. Now that would be more the nature of disconnects, right? So I can have misconnections, I can have disconnections. Circular arguments, which means you're actually presenting as explanation something that's already part of the argument. So when a premise is presented is nothing but the writer's viewpoint restated in different words, then how can it be a premise? It's already his viewpoint. You can negate premises, right? Now, if you negate premises, you can question the premises, but you can't negate facts. So if you negate facts, then what you're saying is that these facts are not true. How can you give me facts and then tell me that they're not true? You can misdirect evaluation, where people, rather than looking at the argument, start looking at the source of the argument. Now that an argument based on misdirected evaluation will also be flawed. You can make inappropriate comparisons or inappropriate analogies, and those would be flaws. So basically what we're saying is things that you can't put together are disconnects, but things that you put together wrongly are misconnects. And these are the kinds of flaws that you can come across. So yeah, those are your concepts then. So you have the argument, you have the conclusions, you have the premises, you have the line of reasoning, you have the assumptions, and then you have the flaws. Okay, so these basically are your construction terms, right? Why am I saying flaws are construction term? Because you identify what goes wrong with the construction. Okay, so these are your construction terms. So moving on, we also have this thing that we call an inference. Now do remember, an inference is not part of an argument. It's not like a conclusion. A conclusion is the intended end result of the argument. An inference is any other bit of understanding you can draw from parts or all of the argument, but they're not intended to be the main conclusion. See, the point is, if a person puts together certain premises, and we'll use the line diagram again, if a certain person puts together certain premises and you recognize what their construction, let's say their connections are, then you realize that, hey, this guy is heading in this direction and he's actually going to end up here. Okay? He's going to end up here. Now that is your conclusion. But you realize if this is true, I can also understand this from it. Now that's an inference. Or if these are true, okay, if these are true, even if I look at them in a slightly different set of circumstances, they can provide me with that understanding. So that means things that you understand which are tangential to the basic purpose. What heads towards the basic purpose is the conclusion, or what provides you the the end result of the direction the argument takes is the conclusion. But bits of understanding that can draw from things happening along the way, or from all of them happening along the way, though they are directed elsewhere. That means tangential bits of understanding are inferences, right? So especially in CR questions, you must remember that the intended end result is the argument, but incidental bits of understanding are inferences. Okay, so let's look at what it says. The dictionary defines inference as the act or process of deriving logical conclusions, which means that conclusions are inferences. True, conclusions are the main inference. But in CR, that's called a conclusion. In CR, we use inferences for the incidental bits, the ideas you can draw which are not necessarily the argument, which are not the argument intended. I don't think the recent circular to students will stop them from coming late to school. A penalty of 5 rupees for a delay of 1 hour is not too much, which means the premise is there is a penalty of 5 rupees for 1 hour delay. But the person says, I don't think the recent circular will stop them from coming late, which means uh, people can afford, let's say, 5 rupees an hour. Now we understand the circular asked students not to come late, and if they shall be asked to pay a penalty of, if they do, they should be asked to pay a penalty of 5 rupees an hour. But when he says, I don't think that the recent circular will stop them from coming in, you're making an assumption, which is uh, they can probably afford to pay 5 rupees, which means you can infer, here that it is not an adequate fine, right? It's not an adequate fine for a certain lot of students. Okay, so this is a general overview we've had of all the basic concepts. Now let's look at a few questions. But before that, I'm going to remind you of a few things here, which you really must keep in mind. Okay, and since I've got a blank space here, then I will use this red pen that I have, and we will talk about a few things. Now, basically, we said that you start with basis. Okay, that means all arguments begin with basis. And in this basis, there could be various elements of basis, okay? All of them working together to deliver a certain flow. They work together in a certain flow and they help you arrive at a certain understanding, okay? Now, these are the premises given, but you realize that if this is the thinking that happens, so instead of putting them that way, let's put them this way then. So these are the premises given, and you realize the way they are organized, there must be a certain kind of thinking that's happening that draws you to a certain understanding. But if that's the understanding, then you realize there are certain things the person has not said, which means I can also recognize assumptions along the way. But both premises and assumptions are basis. But then you realize if this is understanding, then these premises and assumptions actually add up to provide logical elements of basis. Now, if I were to take this understanding and I were to arrive at an end result by way of a decision or a choice or a prediction or a selection, then what have I got? Then I've got that I need to apply this to circumstance, and I might state some circumstances, but I might leave some circumstances to assumption, but then I would arrive at what it is that I'm deciding. So do recognize that certain elements of basis are logical requirements over here, and certain elements of basis are circumstance requirements. It is important to distinguish between the two because then you know how the person constructed their argument. Okay. Now, another area where all this is going to help you a great deal is, apart from CR, in evaluating the structure of arguments when you do your AW, right? So there also you need to be able to recognize how people constructed arguments, but in the construction, what parts were the logical requirements and what parts were circumstances. Because this really good understanding can go into a wrong decision if you don't look at the right circumstances. Correct? Fair enough. So please keep that in mind. Basis has various aspects to it. One aspect is, so we are saying basis has various aspects. One aspect is basis works at two levels. It works at a level of logical requirement and it works at level of circumstance. Secondly, basis can be stated or unstated at both levels. It can be stated or unstated. And thirdly, and this is really important, a lot of us believe that all basis is fact. Please remember that's not the case. I'm not saying that basis is untruth, but basis might be non-fact, which means I might use certain actual facts, but I might use certain experience, certain exposure, certain inclinations also as basis. For instance, I might judge a person by his actual performance, but I might also judge him from, let us say, the fact that I don't think people with a cheerful attitude can actually last very long over here. Now, and I use that as a basis. Now, if I were to make that, so you realize people sometimes use things like biases, or they use inclinations, or they use preferences, or they use favoritism, or they use prejudices, and these are also used as basis and they are non-factual basis. But you must recognize them. I'm not saying that they are good to use. I'm saying you must recognize when people use them because then you know where their arguments can go wrong. You know when their arguments can lose steam. You know when their arguments are shaky. You realize the more factual basis a person has, the more stable their arguments are. But the more non-factual basis a person has, then only persons who are of the same mind will agree with the argument, others will start questioning it. So non-factual basis starts or renders an argument questionable, it renders an argument shaky. Whereas factual basis is typically something that stabilizes an argument. So just keep those things in mind when we come down later to discussing strengthening and weakening of arguments. This will have some bearing on all that. Okay. So now that I had this blank space and I've used my artistic talents over here, let's move on. So we've got questions here and the directions, we don't have them on each slide because it's the same direction. Each of the critical reasoning questions hereafter is based on a short argument, which is somebody's expression of what they understand based on what they've used, a set of statements or a plan of action. For each question, select the best answer from the choices given because there'll be a question as well. Okay. Now let's move on to the first of these questions. So the first of these questions tells us, and let's get our pen in place. Okay. So the first of these questions tells us the country's population has remained relatively constant for the past 2 decades. Okay. So that's one piece of information here, right? Right there. In each of the years, the population from urban areas remained at 30%. That's one piece of information. And 55% of the GDP was contributed by the urban population. So that's another piece of information. And this has been the case in all these years. The rural population accounted for the rest, right, of the population and GDP. That means 30% contributed 55 and by implication therefore 70% contributed only 45, which means what this person is trying to tell me is that this country has urban population that is far more productive than the rural population because 30% are contributing 55 and 70% are contributing only 45. It means the 30% are far more productive than the 70%. That's fairly clear. Now that is what the information would get you to understand, isn't it? So if the question is which of the following can be properly understood from the statements above, we've just done that. We worked out how these things work together. We worked out how they can connect to each other. Therefore, what must be the line of thinking that you would follow with them? And where would that end up? It would end up at an understanding that these guys are better in terms of productivity than the other people are, right? So would it be that the total value of services and products produced by each group has remained mostly unchanged? Total value of services and products produced by each group has remained mostly unchanged. Now, basically what you're saying is that you're already telling me because total value of services and products is what amounts to GDP. So this is merely a restatement. This is only a restatement. You don't need this, right? It is not the conclusion that you're going to draw. The rural population produces goods and services that are of less value than those produced by urban population. No. We are not saying that they were of less value. I cannot conclude that. I'm only concluding that they were in terms of proportion. The proportion was, so if you say they produce goods and services that are of less value, no. If you had told me the rural population produces goods and services that total up to less value, that would also be a repetition. But I cannot conclude that the services themselves are of less value individually, right? Okay. The urban population produces goods and services that are more sophisticated. I don't know about that. We are not talking about complexity or sophistication, right? We cannot conclude that unless you have more information. The per capita monetary value of goods and services produced by rural population is less than that of the urban population. You remember what our thinking was? We said that the urban are more productive than the rural, which is per capita monetary value of goods and services produced by, that means the value of goods and services produced by each person, which means their productivity. So D then corresponds to the thought that we had, which therefore is the conclusion that we're looking at. Products and services that have higher demand contribute to a higher percentage. There isn't enough information here to come down to the demand for products and services. So D is the conclusion to this. Now you understand why we are saying it's a conclusion, because when you take into account the nature of the premises, the connection between the premises and the flow that the premises have, you realize that this is where they're ending up. They're telling us that these guys are more productive than those chaps. So D is your answer here. So how is it explained to us? The urban population accounts for a smaller percentage but contributes a higher share. This implies that urban population produces more goods and services per person than the rural population does. This is restated in option D in different words. Okay. Now, option A is incorrect because based on percentages, we can't infer this part, right? In fact, GDP might have grown substantially over the period and hence value might have increased. But even otherwise, even if none of that happened, it simply told you that they are contributing more GDP than these guys do, which is basically what the argument already says. Incorrect because we cannot infer that goods and services produced by the rural population have less value. As I told you that, unless you talk about the totality is of a total less value, then that's fine. But individually, if I look at goods and services, some of them may be valuable, some may not be. So I can't do this. Incorrect because we cannot infer anything but the sophistication monetary value, which we discussed. It's correct because you realize you're talking about productivity. E is incorrect because it does not consider the rural and urban populations in terms of what was the choice there? Choice was products and services that have higher demand. We don't know what the demand for these products are, right? So we are not looking at that. So D is your answer to this question. Let's look at the next one. Now the next one is about an assumption. And what did I say about an assumption? Look at your situation, recognize what they're talking about, work out what the components are. That means where's the conclusion, what are the premises, realize what the line of reasoning is that puts it together, and therefore what the gaps are and what must fill those gaps. Minimizing input costs and offering incentives for employee productivity are two methods available to Rapture Entertainment for increasing its profitability. That means if they intended to increase profitability, they have two methods available. That means they can minimize input costs and they can offer incentives. So minimizing input costs and offering incentives for employee productivity are two methods available to Rapture Entertainment for increasing its profitability. Reduction in input costs will increase the profit margins more than an incentive offer for productivity, which means of the two, the person says the first lot is better than the next. Therefore, by minimizing input costs, Rapture Entertainment will be doing the best that can be done to increase its profitability. In other words, we are saying that it is possible for them. Now, you realize what we're saying is the line of thinking here is they have two methods available to them. And of the two methods, one is better than the other. And therefore, if they really wanted to minimize input costs, if they wanted to increase profitability, they should adopt the first method. The assumption then is, and this line of thinking would work, you realize there's a gap there. That means you haven't told me what method works for them. So the assumption here is that minimizing input costs works for them and it is possible for them to actually do, right? So they can actually minimize input costs, which is what we're talking about, right? That is one. The other thing is that if you're saying by minimizing input cost, Rapture Entertainment will be doing the best that can be done to increase profitability. You're saying that we've already been told that input costs will increase profit margins more than incentive offer, right? But if they minimize input costs, they'll be doing their best, tells me that this works almost exclusively. But suppose the person uses both, then they could actually do even better, isn't it? So what you're saying is that minimizing input cost actually is going to give you as much benefit as actually using both elements together, which is also an assumption. So I have two assumptions, one of which is that it is possible for them to minimize input cost, and the other being that even with the addition of incentives, they might not be able to improve on reducing input costs. Fine. So expenditure on human resources is not the significant factor influencing the profitability of the company. We've not discussed salaries here. We've not discussed salaries. right? Profitability of rapture entertainment cannot be increased by using both methods together than by minimizing input cost alone, which means you're saying the best they can do is minimize input cost, but you're saying then that offering incentives doesn't do anything at all, because if they'd actually use both, then they can even go better than this, isn't it? So the assumption here is that it cannot be increased by using both methods. You just have to use input cost alone. So I know that. But I looked at the possibility of another assumption, which is it is possible for them to minimize input costs. Rapture Entertainment can minimize input costs in some areas, some of which contribute more to profitability than do the rest. But what about the other areas? This is not enough. It sounds like the assumption that we had in mind. It does sound like that. It can minimize. That means they are capable of doing it. But then we are talking about in some areas. Then I need more information. In which areas and in what proportion would those areas actually work? Rapture Entertainment is an industry that is likely to be profitable only in the long run. We are not talking about the time frame that is involved here. Incentives for the increased productive employees is likely to boost their commitment and morale, which significantly influence the profitability of Rapture Entertainment. But this goes counter to what we've been told. We've already been told that input costs can work more than incentives. So now here you're telling me no, incentives can actually work significantly. Yes, but it doesn't tell me that it's going to work more than input cost is. It does. It still doesn't, in some sense, it's not an assumption in saying that input costs can actually do the best. So E doesn't work there. Now C would be partially to draw attention, because you realize your basic assumption would be they can actually minimize input costs, because if a company can't minimize, then you can't assume. So we can assume that they can we would assume that they can minimize input costs, but this one only says in some areas, which means I need more information to be able to use this assumption. Which areas, how significant are they, what proportion of profitability would they contribute to, and so on. So I have to then go with the other assumption, which is you're saying input costs will work even if you, will work the best, which means that even if you use incentives, that's not going to make much difference anyway. So B then would be your assumption in this question. So let's just look at what we have. So the conclusion that Raptor Entertainment is will be doing its best to increase profitability is supported by the assumption. Of all the options we negate, right? If we negate B, the conclusion becomes void, which means you do need B. Now A is incorrect because the statement on the reduction in input increases profitability cannot assume that human resources it didn't talk about salaries, right? The business of salaries was not there. B is correct as we've discussed. C tells you it's incorrect because the specification of input cost minimizing is not significant. No. It is actually significant if they gave us the totality. If they told us that in every aspect we can actually minimize input costs significantly, but they don't have that information, so it's not significant to this conclusion. We don't have enough to be significant. That's what we're saying. This is incorrect because we are not talking about the long term here, the option D. And E is incorrect because it has nothing to do with the conclusion at all. Correct? So we worked out all that. So over here, the answer would be B. Now let's move to the next question. So this question is about identifying flaws. Between 1970 and 2010, the number of accidents cars met with in the United States increased tenfold. Analysts argue that during the same period, the safety of cars increased rapidly due to technological innovations. Only one of these two facts could be correct. Only one of these two facts could be correct. Since numerical values are more dependable, we can conclude that the analyst's argument about the safety of cars must be questionable. So the argument here is, if there are more accidents, right? If there are more accidents, then you can't say that there are more safety features. Now, what is the flaw in that argument? The fact is that if there are more accidents, it could be in spite of safety features. So if I say that over the last 40 years, the safety features have increased greatly, then I've also got to look at the need for these safety features. So if in the last, in 1970, there was the distance between cars, let's say the traffic was such where the distance between cars was about 100 meters between each car, then the cars don't need safety features as much as they do now. But now if I've come to a point where the distance between each car, the traffic is so thick that the distance between each car on the road is barely 1 meter, then we need lots and lots of safety features. And in spite of them, we might still have accidents. So the point is, This person says, since numerical values are more dependable, we can conclude that the analyst's argument about safety of cars must be questionable. So what is the flaw here? The flaw is that he is not taking into account the increase or the rapid increase in traffic as well. So which of the following actions, if undertaken, best brings about the flaw or demonstrates the flaw in the argument? Okay, which means what would you look at to show that there is a flaw in the argument? Verifying the authority of the analysts who argue for the safety improvements because of technological innovation. That means verifying their authority, seeing under what authority they are making those statements. No, their authority has nothing to do with it. It's not about how qualified they are to ask. Comparing the extent to which a technological innovation can improve the safety with that of earlier levels. That means, can an innovation actually make a car safer than earlier? Maybe it can. That's not going to give you the flaw. Comparing the proportion of cars that met with accidents to the total number of cars during the period, which means the accident rate has to be compared to the traffic that actually existed at that time. If you can give me that, then you will demonstrate what this flaw is. So when you say the proportion of cars that met with accidents to a total number of cars, that means traffic has increased such a great deal that the proportion of cars that met with the accidents is actually lower than the proportion earlier. So when if let us say that traffic was, let us say the traffic was 10 cars in 1970 and accident was 1, then I have 1 on 10. But if my traffic has gone up to 10,000, that means my traffic has multiplied from in by 1,000. Okay, 10 has gone to 10,000, and my accidents have gone from 1 to 10. Now 1 over 10 is not the same thing as 10 over 1,000. You realize? So the point here is, if you compare the proportion of cars that met with accidents to the total number of cars during that period, so the factors, you need to look at the fractions, you need to look at the proportions. Then you would be able to demonstrate that there is a flaw in this argument. Fine. Calculating the percentage of fatal accidents. No, we did not talk about fatal accidents here. We talk about accidents. Now, fatal accidents are those that cause death. That's not the discussion over here. Comparing the proportion of cars that met with accidents to a total number of cars before 1970 and after 19. Why are we looking at before 1970? We talk about between 1970 and 2010. So you don't have to go to before 1970. So obviously C is going to demonstrate the flaw over here. Correct? And it's pretty obvious why. You really have to look at rate based on traffic totally to be able to say that something works or doesn't work. So C is your answer to what would help you demonstrate the flaw. So the question explicitly states that the argument is flawed. This implies that the car safety must have actually improved. With a tenfold increase in number of accidents, the conclusion can be flawed only when there is a tremendous increase in the total number of cars. This can be identified when you actually look at the totality of number of cars and then the proportion of accidents that took place. So option C. Let's look at the next question. So this question says, every cell in the body of any organism has the potential to become cancer-producing malignant tumor, a cancer-producing malignant tumor, and therefore we can expect large animals to actually have a greater chance of cancer than smaller ones. Okay, the understanding here being that larger animals have more cells in their body than smaller ones do, and if every cell can become a tumor, then the chances of the more the cells, the greater the chance. However, humans and beluga whales, which can weigh up to 1800 kg and therefore have lots of cells, share a similar risk for cancer. So humans and beluga whales, the human is only this small and the beluga whale is that large, so therefore there must be a great amount of tissue and cell difference, but they have the same risk. While certain breeds of mice have a much higher risk, that means they have only those many cells, but they are still risky, which means there is something else that happens. If you're going to say, how does this work? Then if the understanding was that the more cells there are, then the greater the risk is, but even animals with a great number of cells don't seem to carry that risk, then it must be there is something that counters that risk. So only if you tell me there is something that counters that risk can this whole thing work together. So which of the following, if true, most helps to resolve the paradox mentioned above? So I have to look for a choice that says there's something that counters the risk in larger animals. So larger animals can actually have a countering mechanism. Fine. The higher the number of cells, the more probability for them to become cancerous. That is what is implied in the first set of statements. So that means that's what's implied over here, isn't it? It's implied here. So we are not talking about solving the paradox. The smaller the size of the animal, the less complex its gene structure. but then why are they being affected by cancer? So it doesn't resolve the paradox. Some cells in certain organisms of certain organs of an organism are less prone to cancer than are other cells in other organs of the same organism. No, we are not comparing cells within an organism. We are not comparing cells within a creature. We are comparing creatures with creatures. The larger the animal, the more effective is its tumor suppressing mechanism, which means there must be something that negates the cancer process. We discussed that when we began, and here it is, right? E says the nature of DNA, which describes the growth and development of any organism, is independent of the size of the animal, which means if it's independent of the size of the animal, then it really shouldn't matter whether, I mean, it will not explain why some small animals have much greater risk than some large animals. So, very clearly, if you tell me the larger animals actually don't have that much risk because they have a better suppressing mechanism, then that answers your question, right? So, D is the answer to this question. So that resolves your paradox. It's paradoxical that larger animals, despite having more cells that can become cancerous, have a lower risk of getting cancer. We need to identify a factor that explains. Logically, there must be something that negates the cancer causing mechanism. So there must be some mechanism in larger animals that prevents cancer, and that is what we found in C. Why are the other ones incorrect? Because if it's true, then animals have a larger risk. We discussed that. Incorrect because the complexity of gene structure is irrelevant. We're not talking about what their gene structure is like. Incorrect because the information does not connect cancer potential to size of an animal. It looks at within organs of the animal. So that's not right. B we looked at as correct. Fine. Incorrect because the nature of DNA is not correlated to the probability of cancer. The point is again, if it was, it would still say it doesn't matter what the size is. So that's not the case. So D is your answer here. What's next? So this question is about strengthening an argument. So before we get to this point, let's ask ourselves, what does it mean to strengthen an argument? So what exactly is an argument? An argument is someone's expression of what they've understood based on what they know, which means there's a conclusion, there are premises, and possibly there may be some assumptions. All of them work together to provide a certain flow that end up with the conclusion, which means that's their construction. That is how they're constructed. If I take away any parts of that, then the argument won't even work. So all the parts have to be there. So how do you strengthen an argument? By providing the parts? No, no, no. The argument already exists. Now you've got to strengthen it. How do you strengthen it? By providing it with support. Which means if you give me circumstances that show that these conditions work, if you give me examples that these conditions work, if you give me, let's say, validity by way of evidence that these bits that you put together here work. So in other words, you give me evidence that your construction is sound. That's how you strengthen an argument. So if I take away a support feature, if I find something that strengthens an argument and take it away, it doesn't mean that the argument falls. The argument is still there, but it's strengthened because this feature that I bring in provides evidence of the argument, basically. So now let's look at this one. Some scholars argue that the authors of the 2000-year-old Dead Sea Scrolls, right, were a small Jewish religious order known as the Essenes living in Qumran, Israel. The authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls were a small Jewish religious order living in this Qumran. By interpreting Ostracon, a legal document recording the surrender of a new member's personal property to this community, these scholars argue that the four-letter word of which the lower half is cut off clearly established the authorship, because that was the script in wide use during the period during which the Dead Sea Scrolls were produced. In other words, they've seen some part of a script and they're saying that this is the kind of script that was used by the Qumran community 2000 years ago. So I need evidence of that, right? So if you give me evidence of the fact that this script is what it is that was actually right, I mean, this is the correct interpretation of that script, and I can give you evidence of that. That means I can give you parallels to show that the script is actually working, or I can give you people have actually worked on the script to establish the fact that this is the script of the time and they've been able to associate it with these characteristics. In other words, I need evidence of the fact that this is to be taken to be the script of that time. Now, A says the script used in Ostracon was used not just by the Essenes live in Qumran, but by many other communities, in which case it would not strengthen the argument. It would say, oh, then it might not be from them, it could be from somebody else. Okay. The missing lower half of the four-letter word has been correctly interpreted since the shapes of the alphabet of the script, they mean the letters of the alphabet, are fully deciphered by modern scientists. That means modern scientists have understood what the letters of the alphabet are, and therefore these missing lower half can be nothing but what it is that is represented by the top half. That means there's evidence from study. There is evidence from study to show that these are the right letters. So let's just keep that there. People who went against the traditions of the Qumran community had to surrender all their property. That is nothing that points to the validity of the script. The scholars who possessed the hypothesis are the ones who had extensive knowledge. No, we still want to know that it's about the script. Most of the time, scholars inferring about ancient times depend on indirect evidence, which proves controversial because of differences of opinion. Again, where are you telling me about evidence of the script? There is only one thing here that talks about, because we are saying that was the script in wide use, and that is the reason. This is the reason. Because they believe that that was the script in wide use, they are actually using it. So I must have evidence that that was actually the right script. And this is the only one that tells me that there has been some study of the script and we have determined that it was the right script. So B is the one that strengthens that argument. So what do we have? These scholars argue that the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls were Jewish religious order members based on the interpretation of a word. If this word's interpretation is right, then the scholars' argument is strengthened. Interpretation in terms of the script used, isn't it? And the only place where we discuss script is in B. A is incorrect because if it's true, then we cannot actually say that they were the authors. It could have been somebody else. C is incorrect because it's not relevant to the authorship, because authorship here is being determined by script, and that is true about D as well. And it's also true about E. So the only one that talks about script is B, and therefore B is the answer, which strengthens the argument by saying there is evidence to show that what you believe about the script is actually true. So that is strengthening an argument. Then we come down to weakening an argument. Now, just as we said that if you find evidence to support bits that are used in an argument, then you strengthen it. Weakening an argument would mean that you don't try to demolish it. You don't try to say that this argument doesn't make sense. But you identify what makes the argument and then you say, I will show you certain conditions under which those bits don't work. Which means your argument works, but it does not work everywhere where you're saying it works. I'll show you places where it doesn't work. So if I give you examples of circumstances or conditions, or I give you conditions under which this argument will not work, then I weaken the argument because I'm not demolishing it. I'm just saying it works there, but it doesn't work here. So that would weaken an argument. In other words, you reduce its applicability, right? So if you increase the applicability of an argument, you strengthen it. If you reduce the applicability, you weaken it. Most of the lore of ancient cultures, right, mention golden ages and dark ages. Scientists argue that this phenomenon was because of the binary star system, a system of two stars, of which the sun is one star and the other star is either lost or not found till now. How do you make that statement then? There's a system of two stars of which the sun is one star and one star is either lost or not found till now. Okay. Just as the orbital motion of the earth around the sun causes the cycle of seasons, the binary motion, these scientists argue, causes a cycle of rising and falling ages over a long period of time. So you talk about some invisible star that causes rising and falling ages. Okay. Now that's why we said don't worry about craziness of arguments. Go with what the argument says. So one star, that is the sun, causes the cycle of seasons, and the other star causes the cycle of rising and falling cultural periods or industrial periods or development and so on and so forth. So which of the following, if true, would most weaken the scholar's argument described above? With the technology that is at our disposal, scientists identify even the practically invisible stars which are further away from the earth than is the sun, which means if there was a star there, we would have found it. The technology now is good enough for us to be able to find it. In which case, it is possible that there is no star. He's not come to the point of saying that there is no star at all, and we don't know that. But with the technology, it is possible to identify the star, and therefore, since we haven't identified it, it is very likely that there possibly is no star. Okay. Most astronomers now agree that most stars we see are part of a binary or multiple star system, many of which are yet to be discovered. That is not pertinent to how does it relate to us on Earth, where we have golden ages and dark ages. The movement of the solar binary system occurs because the sun has a companion star which along with the sun orbits a common center of gravity. That tells you how the binary system would work if it was there. But we are talking about the binary system actually makes available some or provides for some impact on the ages itself. Huge changes in electromagnetic fields of a binary star system are necessary to show a major influence on the Earth. So, which means we have to study the electronic magnetic fields to show how they influence Earth. We are not talking about that. We are saying you want to weaken the argument which says maybe there isn't a binary star, or maybe the binary star doesn't have this kind of strength to bring about what you're talking about. E. No other binary star system has in their proximity planets that are comparative to Earth, which means we are unique, which doesn't weaken the argument. What weakens the argument is if there was a star, we would have found it by now, which means in all likelihood there is no such star. Okay, so that would be what weakens the argument. So the scientists argue that the binary star system is the reason for golden ages and dark ages. We need to cast doubt on this. The information is present in option A, which implies that if there had been a star, it would have been discovered by now. This casts doubt on the argument. Okay, thus option A is the best option. All the others don't even work. B, because it actually strengthens the argument. C, because it does not explain the effects of binary stars. And similarly D, without information we can't tell about the binary system. E, because it's not even relevant to the discussion. So A is the answer to that question. All right. Now let's move on. So these questions, or this question here, is a sample of what we call paragraph completion. Now you can possibly figure out what that means. If you're being asked to complete a paragraph, it means you're being asked to recognize the line of reasoning and do whatever is necessary to complete that line of reasoning. It might mean arriving at a conclusion. It might mean providing premises that are necessary. It might mean providing a connection between statements. In some sense, to establish that line of reasoning. So to complete a paragraph would mean to complete the thread of thought that is actually in that paragraph. So you have to recognize what the paragraph is attempting to convey and recognize what would enable that thread of thought to be completed to convey what it wants to convey. Fine. So let's try that with this one. The focus on planning leads seamlessly to cost-based thinking. It leads seamlessly to cost-based thinking means almost automatically people, when they plan, they come to cost-based thinking. Costs lend themselves wonderfully to planning because by and large they are under the control of a company, which plays the role of a customer deciding what goods and services are to be purchased. There indeed are exceptions. Government agencies impose taxes and other compliance related fees. However, these costs that are beyond the control of a company are insignificant because it can only be are insignificant because they have to be paid, so they are not going to be within your frame at all, or it could be because they are not going to matter in your planning because they are such a small proportion of what you're dealing with. But even the first one is true. They're insignificant in the planning process because they are not in your control. They are beyond your control. They're insignificant planning process because they are static. They cannot be changed, right? But it can also be because they are a very small proportion overall. So what are you saying? So what we are looking at is governments impose taxes based on um, governments impose taxes based on the welfare of the society rather than business cycle fluctuations. That doesn't tell us why it's going to. It doesn't say when you say because you're looking at a reason for being insignificant, right? So you want a reason that supports the word insignificant. Insignificant. So A doesn't do that. B, the higher the turnover of the company, the higher the percentage of corporate income tax the company has to pay. So how is it insignificant? It doesn't tell me that. When a company acts like a customer, it tends to buy goods and services from vendors that offer them at lowest prices. And here you're telling me about where it is they can manage costs. So what about the ones where they can't manage? This doesn't tell me about a reason for that. Cost-based thinking makes a company fall into a trap of thinking not conducive to innovation and advancement of the product sold by a company. This is a different disadvantage, not as part of this particular argument here. So it's not related to what we're talking about. Costs imposed on the company by others make up a relatively small fraction of the overall picture. And this is what we worked out, isn't it? Insignificant because they don't matter very much. I need that pen back. So they're insignificant because they don't seem to matter very much, right? So let's just see that. So the statement here is costs imposed by others, that is beyond the control of, are insignificant because they are a relatively small fraction of the overall cost picture. So this is fairly easy then. E finishes your paragraph. But do remember, it's not always about finding reasons. It could also be about finding conclusions. It could also be about providing the statement that connects to other statements and so on, and completes the, basically what you want is a complete line of reasoning, and this is what the last statement or completing the paragraph would do. Okay, so E here completes the paragraph. So the argument concludes that the costs beyond the control of a company are insignificant. We need to identify a reason because it continues the sentence with the because. Option E gives us this reason. Option A is incorrect as it does not provide that those costs are beyond the control of the company. B is incorrect because then government imposed taxes actually become significant. C is incorrect because it's not relevant to costs that are beyond the company's control. And D is incorrect because it talks about cost-based thinking and is not relevant to the discussion that we are having. So E is the answer to this paragraph completion question. Let's move on. The next one we have is what we call a boldface type question. Now, what happens here is that people have, they present to you this question, and there'll be two parts of the statement or two parts of the paragraph that are presented in boldface. Now, what you have to do is you have to recognize what the context is, you have to recognize what the arrangement is, you have to recognize what the line of thinking is, and then work out what the role of each statement is. That means you identify roles, you identify conclusions, you identify premises, types of premises and all that, and you identify how they're connected in the line of reasoning. And then you realize the boldface are going to ask you typically something related to their roles. What is the role of the first one? What is the role of the second one? How are the roles of the two related? How are they related to the overall structure? In other words, you're looking at what is the function of these two within the overall discussion that we have. And you know that your question is going to be like that, isn't it? So let's look at what we have here. Since James Macpherson published what he claimed were translations of ancient Scottish Gaelic poetry by a 3rd century poet named Ossian, scholars have questioned the authenticity of the works. So we know that scholars have questioned Macpherson's work and contemplated on whether they were misappropriated from Irish mythology or, as construed at the time, authored by a Scottish equivalent to Homer. So they might not be by a 3rd century poet named Ossian. They might simply be copied from the Irish, or they might actually be authored by a Scottish equivalent to Homer, some poet or some poet who actually spoke the epic. Recently, researchers have revealed the structures of the social networks underlying the Ossian's works and their similarities to Irish mythology, which means some part of what they were talking about, which means this part, is actually in some sense being referred to here. Recently, researchers have revealed the structures of social networks underlying Ossian's work and their similarities to Irish mythology. The study revealed that the networks in the Scottish poems bore no resemblance to epics by Homer, but strongly resembled those mythological stories from Ireland. So now we know what the person says. He's saying that this guy said that they were by this 3rd century poet named Ossian, but scholars have questioned the works and they have questioned them on two grounds. One, they were possibly taken from Irish mythology, or two, there might be another poet. But the study shows there's no other poet, but they could be similar to the stories from Ireland. In other words, we have the question and we have one of the features that was the base of that question is actually justified. So something that justifies the question. We have a question and what justifies that question. So I need to look at a choice. So in the argument above, the two portions in boldface play which of the following roles, which means the first boldface raises a question and the second provides detail that justify the asking of that question. Fair enough. So basically that's what we're looking at. So what do we have here then? A. The first is the assumption that supports the main argument. No, scholars have questioned the authority. Authenticity is not the assumption. It's the argument of the scholars. That means they are saying that this is wrong. While the second is evidence that supports that main conclusion. Now, the first is not the assumption that supports the main conclusion. The first is the main conclusion. And the second is evidence that supports that conclusion. Right? So it's not A. B. The first is evidence given to support a view that the argument seeks to refute. Now, the first is evidence. No, the first is the refutation itself. While the second is the view the argument seeks to disprove. Now, first is a refutation of Macpherson's view. The first is a general statement used to introduce the argument. Whose argument? The argument of scholars, namely that these works are not authentic, while the second presents evidence that supports that stance. So the first is a general statement used to introduce the argument, which is scholars have questioned, and the second presents evidence that support that question. That's what we were looking at, right? So C is a possibility here. What about D? The first is what the argument seeks to disprove. No, that's what the argument is presenting. The first is the main conclusion of the argument. Maybe. While the second is a potential objection to the main conclusion. No, the second is a piece of evidence that supports that conclusion. So C will be the answer here. Fair enough. The argument is that Ossian's poems were misappropriated from Irish mythology. We need to identify the relationship of the highlighted sentences in the light of this information. A is incorrect because the first is not an assumption. B is incorrect because the author does not use the first to refute anything. C is correct because the first introduces the argument itself and the second provides the evidence to support that argument. So C is correct. D is incorrect because the argument does not disprove the existence of controversy. The argument presents controversy. And E is incorrect because the first is not the main conclusion of the argument. That's not the point. E is incorrect because the first is the main conclusion, while the second is a potential objection to the main conclusion. This is what's wrong with it. It's not a potential conclusion to it, is potential evidence of, right? So that is why E is also wrong. So answer then would be C. Let's look at another question type. So you also get questions that ask you to evaluate or ask you how appropriate an argument is. So let's consider those. So this one presents this passage. The question of how plague spread during the second pandemic, 12th and 19th centuries, 12th to 19th centuries, has remained controversial. It was proposed that the mode of transmission was either via rats or direct human-to-human transmission via fleas and lice. Researchers used mathematical models to study the movement and rate of spread and found that the historical data between 1348 and 1813 show similarities in 7 out of 9 outbreaks, with mode of the disease spread by fleas and lice, not by rats. Thus they concluded that human parasites such as fleas and lice and not rats are responsible for spreading the disease. Now let's just go over that again. It was proposed that the mode of transmission was either via rats or direct human-to-human transmission via fleas and lice. That means the carriers were humans and fleas and lice carried it from one human to another. That's what human-to-human transmission is. Researchers used mathematical models to study the movement and rate of spread and found that the historical data between these two show similarities in 7 out of 9 outbreaks, with the mode of disease spread by fleas and lice between humans, not by rats. Thus, they concluded that human parasites such as fleas and lice and not rats are responsible. But if you talk about human to human transmission, you're really saying that humans were the carriers. So, how did the human who was the first carrier get the disease? The fleas and lice are only the connection between humans. But what about how did they get the disease? So, which of the following would it be most useful to know in order to evaluate the researcher's conclusion? What it would be most, let us say, significant know is, was there something that we need to know as to how the humans first got the disease, which then they were able to spread? So I need some more information. What kind of information? Do mathematical models that were developed use mathematical formulae that are too difficult to understand? Really doesn't matter. Whoever understood them did understand them. So it doesn't matter about how difficult it was to understand. Did the spread of plague via fleas significantly differ from the spread via lice? I don't know, because they're saying fleas and lice. They're not saying fleas or lice. So they're actually clubbing the two together into one medium, right? Do the mathematical models ignore any factor that significantly influences the spread of the disease? That means, is there some factor that actually makes a difference that they have actually left out? And you realize, how did the human first get the disease? Now, if you know that, then you have a factor that significantly influences the spread. So the humans first got the disease, then it was spread. But it's not going to spread unless the human got the disease from somewhere. So has the mathematical model ignored that factor? Possibly yes. So do we need that factor in? Yes, we do. What about the next one? So the next choice tells me the two outbreaks that did not show any similarity to the model of the disease spread by fleas and lice indicate any other mode of transmission. Now, 2 out of 9, isn't it? Now, 2 out of 9, in fact, 7 out of 9 is a better sample assessment than 2 out of 9. So very clearly, if 2 out of 9 tell me otherwise, then I need a lot more information to be able to use D. So far, C is something that we're looking at. Have the scientists used mathematical models in any subject other than physics and chemistry? Doesn't matter. Can they not use it in identifying pandemics? Maybe they could. The fact is not where do we use mathematical models. The fact is my mathematical model complete? That means, and we realize that if you're talking about, see, the point here is human to human transmission would mean that humans basically have played. That means the human is the person who is the carrier himself. But he's a carrier. How did he get the disease? Where did he get the disease from? So, were they factors that you have to build into your model to determine how the disease began in humans? So, I need that. Okay, so C is the answer to this question, which is why that's the answer. We need to identify the information that helps us evaluate the conclusion. For this type of question, we need to study every option individually and decide. A is incorrect because the complexity of mathematical models is not relevant. B is incorrect because it is plagued by lice and fleas and not lice or fleas. So we are not looking at a comparison. C is correct because if the question gets a positive answer, then the conclusion will be incorrect. Which means if yes, we do need more information, then this conclusion is wrong. And if no, we don't need any more information, then the conclusion is correct. But we do need information. We know that. And that information is how did the first human get the disease? B is incorrect because the information is not relevant to the conclusion. What is that information? B is about do the two outbreaks that did not show any similarity. No, the fact is we looked at 2 out of 9 is not something that we pay as much attention to when we've got 7 out of 9. And E is incorrect because this is irrelevant information. Have they used mathematical models elsewhere other than physics and chemistry? Which means you're questioning whether they can use mathematical models here. That's not relevant to the discussion. So C is the answer to this question. Okay, now let's move on to the next one. So we also have miscellaneous questions. Now, miscellaneous questions could be of various types. They could be just worded in a manner that you don't put your finger straight away in the task, but they could be asking you about line of reasoning typically. They could be asking you to complete a thought pattern, maybe, stuff like that. So let's just see. The 10th one here. A newspaper is considering changing its policy concerning content writing job allocations. Currently, the company allocates a number of articles to be written on a specific subject, such as politics or sport or business, to writers who write on that specific subject only. The proposed policy would enable editors to allocate any subject to any writer if she or he has free time during office hours, implying then that what a specialist can do, other people can do equally well, or implying that the newspaper is generally not bothered about the quality of writing. So there are two things here. One is that it tells us that the editor believes that any decent writer can do the same job even if they don't have specialized knowledge. Or it tells us that the editor is not bothered about whether the article is really good or not. He just wants it to be printed. One of the two. So the adoption of this policy would be most likely to decrease the quality of articles if the writer's job functions required them to. So that means if the writer's job functions required them to write without gathering any more knowledge, then yes, the quality of articles would go down. All right. So if the job function would require them to write a specific number of articles during a working day, okay, or if their job function use specific jargon in a specific subject to make the article interesting. Now, if you were to use technical and subject specific jargon, but these people don't have it, then the article is not going to have the quality that you expect, isn't it? Okay. If the article, if he was given if they were asked to require them to do a lot of research to write a single article, that would mean that they would actually do the study that would make quality actually possible, isn't it? If the writer's job functions required them to work late hours most of the time as publication starts, it doesn't matter what are they doing during those late hours. Are they doing a good job or a bad job? We don't know. If it required them to work in collaboration with other workers for various reasons, then you must tell me what the reasons are. If the other workers were so that you can gather information from them, fine. So you realize what we are saying is if you expect them to be able to write like a specialist does, then they don't have that knowledge that enables them to write like a specialist does, which means you're probably not going to get the quality that you want. So B then is going to see a drop in quality. Okay, so 10, your answer would be B. Fair enough. So what we have there? We need to identify a condition which is not favorable to this policy. A is incorrect because it's likely to favor them because you're saying you give them a specific number of articles as per availability of time and they will probably do what they need to do it. B is correct because if that is true, then they don't have the jargon that they can use to write it effectively. C is incorrect because if they do have time, then they can actually write an article and they are allocated based on availability. D, incorrect because this favors the policy, which is asking people to actually study and put their stuff together. E, incorrect because this has no relevance. It really doesn't matter whether we're talking about collaborating with other workers or not. So C, you're actually giving them time to do a good job. D, it really doesn't matter because it's not about how much time you give them to work. E is about working with other people. But the point is, B, if they need specific jargon and they don't have it, then the subject is not going to be as interesting as you expect it to be. So B is your answer. Now let's look at another miscellaneous question. Okay. So I'm given three things. I'm given a strategy. What is the strategy? Interested in improving the financial status of its employees, work high, a manufacturing company, increase the salary offered to employees who work for the company by more than 5 years by 20%, which means this was their strategy. They wanted to improve the financial status of its employees and they increased the salary offered to employees who worked for the company for more than 5 years by 20%, thereby improving their financial status. Wait. Now, their financial status will increase if real incomes increase. You know that. If costs have also increased by 20% or more, then improving their salary is not going to improve their financial status. Okay. Observation. Many of the employees who receive the hike are not able to save more than what they were able to before the hike in their salaries, which obviously tells you that even though they got 20% more, they couldn't save anything. Therefore, their financial status didn't really improve. That's because they actually were spending that extra 20% on 20% increase in cost. Fine. So they were not able to save. Okay. Additional information. The rate of inflation remained constant during the 2-year period and the employees were given the benefits without any delay as per the requirements of company policy. But that means I understand that the rate of inflation actually ensured that the 20% increase was actually wiped out. It all went into expenditure and nothing went into saving. So that being the case, what are we looking at? In the light of additional information, which of the following, if true, does most to explain that which is given after the application, which means gives enough to explain the observation. What would explain the observation? The company's cost of production increased substantially. This is not about cost of production. This is about how much money they paid their employees. The financial condition of the employees serving the company for less than 5 years did not show any improvement, though their salaries too were increased. Still, I need to know the reasons for that. So you're not saying they couldn't improve, so these guys can't improve. Obviously, I have to look at these guys and say they couldn't improve in spite of 20%. That can only be because they actually had to spend that 20%. The company has given incentives only to those employees whose performance has increased more than the average performance. This is not what the passage says. The passage says that they actually gave 20% to everybody who had more than 5 years of service, right? So C is not relevant. D says employees of the company increase their savings whenever they get a substantial increase in salary. If that's the case, then they would actually have saved, but I'm told that they didn't save. E says the cost of goods and services that are not considered in the calculation of inflation increases substantially during the 2-year period, which means you've got a cost of inflation, you've got the rate of inflation, but there are things that they had to buy which have gone much beyond that, which means whatever it is that you've given them by way of increase has actually got spent and it's not saved. Therefore, your 20% has not done anything. It has all got swallowed up in what it is that they had to spend. So E is the answer to that question. So let's see what we have here. So though the company increased the salary of some employees and inflation rate remained constant, their financial condition is not improved. We need to find a factor that is outside the domain of inflation. That is in E. It says that the things that you consider for inflation, well, apart from that, there are other things that these guys had to spend their money on, which means they could not save, which is why E is the option over here. Okay. Here's another miscellaneous one. The company spokesman says, today's medical formulations need to undergo dynamic changes. Every advance in a formulation to prevent a specific disease increases the drug resistance of the disease causing organism. A company that is satisfied with its existing pharmaceutical formulations will soon find that its medicines are not effective. At CureWell, improving the efficiency of our formulations is our goal. So what has he got here? He's giving you a statement of opinion here, which means you need to undergo dynamic changes, okay? Who any medical formulation, which means what it is that the composition of a medicine is, okay? That is because there is resistance to drugs that organisms derive. And if a company stays with its formulations, it will soon find that they don't work. At Cure Well, improving the efficiency of our formulations is our goal, which means they must be working on trying to improve or trying to identify the changes in what changes they need to make to their medicines to keep them effective even with changing organisms. So which of the following must be true on the basis of those statements? Then what must be true is that they are actually working to be able to keep pace with changes in disease causing organisms. So Curewell's competitors produce formulations that can be improved as rapidly as Curewell does. No relevance to what we're discussing. This guy is not talking about his competition. A company that cannot advance its formulations adapting to evolving disease causing organisms cannot remain profitable in the long run. Already told to us over here, all right, in a slightly different fashion. If a company does not concentrate on advancements of formulations, the efficiency of its medicines may not decrease. No, may not increase, not may not decrease. Okay. Curewell's goal becomes realistic only when its formulations can be consistently improved. That means if they are talking about this, then they should be improving their formulations all the time. So we realize that, okay. E. Curewell's formulations are currently satisfied with the efficiency of formulations produced by it. No, they are not satisfied. He says we will always be trying to improve, which means our goal will be realistic only when we can actually improve the quality of our formulations. So D would be the answer to this question. So what we have here, we need to identify the statement that must be true based on the information given. So we need to evaluate every possibility. Now A is incorrect because this may or may not be true. What is A? It says that a company that cannot, Curewell's competitors, we don't know. We've not discussed competitors. B says a company that cannot advance cannot remain profitable. But that is incorrect because it's also a possible situation, not a certain situation. Also, it is no different from what the person has already told us, or at least what is already implied in this part. No, it's actually told to us over here in a slightly different sense. So it's only a repetition. What about C? If a company does not concentrate its medicine, the efficiency may not decrease. That's contrary to what Acid discussed, right? So you're not talking about the fact that their efficiency may not decrease. D is correct because if that's what he's talking about, then they're probably going to work on improving their efficiency significantly. So that's what we're looking at. E is incorrect because we are talking about, what should we say? They're currently satisfied with the efficiency. No, it's pretty clear that they're not satisfied. He says we can't remain satisfied with what we currently are at. We've got to keep looking at improving. So D is the answer that you want. Let's move to the next question. A company board director says, all our company's products are inspected by your department for quality standards that are directed by our company's mission statement. All our company's products are inspected by your department, namely a quality department, for quality standards that are directed by our company's mission statement. Yet only 0.01% are ever rejected. Therefore, since the effect of such low percentage on the company's reputation cost of rejecting is negligible, whereas the operating costs of your department are considerable, for economic reasons alone, it is only because your department must be dissolved. In other words, we have you to clear or to check quality, but you reject only 0.01%, which means our quality must be great. So why do we really need you? We can actually dump with you. We can actually dump your department. The quality head department says, the quality department head says, I don't agree. It's only because our department exists that many employees of our company comply with stringent quality standards we maintain, resulting in such a low rejection rate. So what is the quality department head's response? The company has a board director has an argument that since rejections are low, we don't need you. This guy says rejections are low because we are around and people are in some sense scared of us, right? So he's actually giving you the reason why they should still be around and therefore countering the company board directors, let's say, argument, right? So he's rejecting the director's argument while proposing that standards should be enhanced? No. Is he providing evidence to show that the director has given undue stress to economic factors? No, that's not discussed here. Is he bringing out a benefit that the director has overlooked in his argument? Quite right. He says the benefit of having us here is that we are watchdogs and your guys will actually comply with quality standards. And if we weren't here, there would be nothing to cause them to comply. So yes, he is bringing out a benefit. He is arguing that the factors are not economical. No, he's not looked at the economics of remaining. He's accepting the reasoning of the argument. No, he's not. So C is the answer to this question, right? He's actually saying because we are around, you benefit from greater attention being paid by the production staff. So the director has not actually realized that. So that's what he's bringing to his notice. So C is the answer to that question. Okay. So the director argues that the spending on the quality department is not needed. Quality department head argues that the department is instrumental in maintaining good standards, and therefore option C works. That means since we are here, your guys maintain good standards. That's why we have a low rejection rate. Okay. So this question tells us accurately assessing the efficiency of automation is rather complex. For instance, we can consider automation in computer chip manufacturing. People often argue that the process is more productive if more number of chips are produced per machine, that is what people would like to assess capacities as. They would like to assess automation in the sense of how much can a machine turn out and can we actually run with that. So they are looking at automation in terms of output. But this person questions that assessment. He says, but is this beyond question? What if more chips are rejected in quality control per machine at the same time that more are manufactured? So he says what's wrong with this assessment is, suppose you actually had higher rejections of quality, then what's the point of turning out more machines? So the objection implied here, okay, to the assessment here is based on doubts about the truth of which of the following statements. That means somebody is going to give you a statement here, the truth of which these people are doubting. Okay, there's going to be a statement in the choices. The truth of that statement is going to be doubted by these guys. Now, computer chip industry is the industry in which automation is quite freely used. They are not going to doubt the truth of that. While computing the efficiency of automation, the whole process, not a single machine, is to be considered, but they are actually talking about single machines here. The quality of production can be correctly ignored in calculating. So if you're making a statement saying you don't need to bother about quality when you calculate efficiency, that question, that is the truth of that statement is what these guys would get. So the truth of this statement is what these objectionists would object to. The number of chips produced is irrelevant to the computation of efficiency. No, he's actually saying that the assessment is number of chips, and this guy is saying should number of chips matter? No, but should number of chips matter when quality might be at risk? So the truth of C would be in question. Automation is needed in any industry that wants to enhance its efficiency. That is not something that's related to this argument. So your answer here would be C. Why is that? Because if C was a statement being made, the quality of production can be ignored, then the truth of that statement is what it is that the objector to this assessment, that means this is the objector, the truth of this statement is what this person would be objecting to. So C is your answer. So as per the question, we need to identify a statement which, when true, makes the objection valid. For such a question, we need to verify everyone. So we are saying A is wrong because it's not relevant. B is wrong because the statement is not relevant to, it's about whole processes and not machines. C is the one because if that is true, then the objection is actually valid because the objection is you need to consider quality. And D is incorrect because it's not logically true for the objection to be correct. What is D? D says that the number of chips produced is irrelevant to the computation of efficiency. No, that's exactly what the assessment is based on, but it's not what the objection is based on. The objection is based on the fact that, but you may not have quality. So making a statement saying you can ignore quality is what they're objecting to. And E says automation is needed everywhere. That is irrelevant. Okay. Now he's not saying that it's not about the author seeks to disprove. He's saying the author says there should be an optimum. The author says, yes, have automation, but not to the point where it's going to impact on your quality, right? So your option here would actually be C. So with that, we finished these questions. So now what we've attempted to do in this particular session is we've attempted to take you through the basics in terms of what the concepts are so that you can train yourself to think on those lines. We've attempted to take you through different question types to tell you what the approach should be of the basics that we looked at. That means keeping the basics in mind, what's the approach we should adopt. And then the identification of identify your situation, work out the components, recognize the line of reasoning, and only then approach the question, because you've got to get the first three steps in place first. If I start going down to choices before I work out these three steps, then I'll get drawn to choices which might attract me even though they don't answer the question. So please remember, three steps are essential. Understand the situation given to you and your task. Recognize the components that you actually can identify, that you identify, and see how they're related. That means work out the line of reasoning. Once you've got this in place, then you can work out the assumptions as well. Then you got the argument. Then you look at the construction elements or the evaluation. So you must work out these three steps before you take up the question. But you can't train yourself to do this. Now, the other important thing is everybody believes that more and more CR practice actually makes you better. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it doesn't make you better on its own. It's not just more CR practice that you need. You need more CR practice along with a regular reading habit. And reading what? Read articles where people have opinions. Read articles where people raise criticism. Read articles where people make suggestions. Because every piece of criticism, every opinion, every suggestion is actually the end of an argument. Then you can work backwards in that article and recognize what the reasons are, recognize what the line of thinking is, recognize what the assumptions must be, recognize what it is that could impact on it either by way of strengthening or weakening it. So that means do the practice in CR, keep the basics in mind, complement it with a really good reading habit where you read opinion based stuff, and it actually is going to make a difference. Then you can handle it not only in CR questions, but you can handle it when they appear in RC as well. And it will help you with your evaluation in AW. So good preparation with CR is going to help you in more than just CR, right? So, and that is something you must keep in mind. So keep these basics in mind and keep the reading also in mind and go ahead with your practice. Okay. All the best.